Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be back here again, worshiping with you this morning. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 26 years old when he became the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the group that was charged with organizing a boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama city bus system by some 40,000 African American riders, with the goal of ending the system of segregated bus seating. 26. He was 26, fresh out of school, the new young pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and now he was also a target. The Montgomery bus boycott began December 5th, 1955. By January of 1956, Dr. King was receiving 30 to 40 abusive and threatening letters a day, every day, from the angry white citizens of Montgomery. But the letters were not the worst part, because the King household was also receiving 25 or more obscene and threatening phone calls every day. Now, the letters you could throw down on the coffee table, right? Read whenever you were ready to do that. But they had to answer the phone, because it might be a civil rights worker on the other end of the line with important information about an action that was happening that they needed to know about. It might be an organizer, or it might be someone threatening Dr. King's life, or the life of his wife, Coretta Scott King, who also had to answer that phone, or it might be someone threatening their infant daughter. According to historian Stephen Oates, writing in his biography of Dr. King called "Let the Trumpets Sound," the barrage of threats began to wear on King. He began to jump whenever the phone rang. He was feeling fearful and exhausted. And his friends, people like Ralph Abernathy, they knew something was wrong. They were asking him about it, but there was nothing they could really do to help him. He was alone in this. One late, exhausted night, King answered the phone, as he must, and a furious man on the other end told King in the most hate-filled voice imaginable that if he didn't stop the boycott, they would blow up his house. They would bomb his home. And something in King broke, he says, and he felt like he must quit. And then Oates tells what came next. King bowed over his kitchen table and he prayed aloud. And this is what he prayed: Lord, I'm down here trying to do what is right, but Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I'm at the end of my powers, he prayed. I have nothing left. I can't face it alone. Then King would later say he felt a presence stirring in him, and he heard an inner voice which said to him, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and I will be with you even unto the end of the world. King's trembling stopped. He felt an inner calm he had never experienced before. And he realized in his own words, I can stand up without fear. I can face anything. So today, death threats have become weirdly prevalent as a tool of social and political intimidation, right? School board members get death threats, election poll workers get death threats, healthcare advisors, Dr. Fauci gets death threats. You could almost get inured to it unless it's happening to you, and then it's no joke. It was certainly no joke in 1956. These were not idle threats. On January 30th, 1956, just a few days after Dr. King prayed for courage, a bomb exploded on the front steps of his home, shattering the windows and sending broken glass flying through the living room. Fortunately, King's wife and daughter, who were home, were in the back of the house, and they weren't harmed. King got the news while he was out organizing. He flew home, he comforted his family, and then he convinced an angry, gathered crowd of his supporters not to retaliate, to keep their commitment to nonviolence. On February 1st, the home of another civil rights leader, E.D. Nixon, was bombed. And in the days immediately after the two bombings, Dr. King had armed bodyguards around his home to protect his family. But ultimately, his commitment to nonviolence was such that he sent the guns away. He sent even that protection away. Guns attract guns, he felt, and he would put his trust in love. Now, as the boycott continued, the violent threats in Montgomery escalated, but it had become clear by now that they would not dissuade the protesters. In response, a grand jury called for the arrest of 89 civil rights organizers, including Dr. King, for violating an obscure labor law that prohibited boycotts. Now, King was in Nashville at the time working when the grand jury decision came down. And he knew if he returned to Montgomery, he would surely be arrested. And once he was in jail, he would again be in risk of personal, physical danger. His parents wanted him to go back to their home in Atlanta instead, where he would be safe. But Dr. King told his father, "My friends and associates are being arrested. I would rather be in jail for 10 years than desert my people now." His words. He returned to Montgomery. He was arrested, and he stood trial, where he was found guilty and ordered to pay a fine. Struggle continued until November, when the Supreme Court unexpectedly affirmed that Alabama segregation laws were unconstitutional. Dr. King had won. That night, in response to the Supreme Court order, the Klan paraded through the Black neighborhood with torches, determined to intimidate the Black people of Montgomery into submission. And Oates writes that where before the Black people would have locked their doors and stayed inside when the Klan came parading through their neighborhoods, on this night, they went out and they sat on their porches and they waved cheerfully to the Klansmen and their hateful motorcade because they knew that they had won and they were not afraid. For the rest of his life, Dr. King fought what he identified as a triumvirate of interlinked social ills: racism, militarism, and poverty. In 1956, he was fighting racism and segregation. In 1967, in a speech in New York City, he came out against America's involvement in the Vietnam War. When he was murdered just a year later, he was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington and a campaign on behalf of striking sanitation workers. Underneath all of it was a vision of a world transformed by radical love, such that all people have the opportunity for the fullest development of the self, in which all are cared for and included. Dr. King called this the beloved community, language which is echoed in the proposed eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism. As King worked toward this vision, he attracted the hostile attention not just of racists, but of the FBI, who added to the chorus of threats that were not idle threats at all. There were many and powerful forces arrayed against him and threatening him all manner of harm. And yet in the speech he gave the day before he died, he closed by saying again that he was not afraid. The courage he prayed for so long had never deserted him. We need courage. We need courage. Courage is counted a virtue because life, just in its ordinary course, is risky enough, right? I mean, we need some measure of gumption just to be able to deal appropriately with the ordinary risks we face. But then sometimes in the course of our lives, that which is noblest and best within us calls us to take more significant risks, even extraordinary risks. This might not be the risk of physical harm, but then again, it might be. Labor activist Dolores Huerta, who was organizing boycotts on behalf of migrant workers in the 1960s, was beaten by San Francisco police while peacefully protesting in 1988. An officer broke her ribs and shattered her spleen. She required emergency surgery to remove it. She nearly died. She was 58. When we work to make real change for justice, when we threaten the systems of the powerful, or even the merely comfortable, those systems can respond violently. But there are other risks and other losses than just the risk of violence. We can lose our jobs, or lose family or friends, or lose clients when we risk up or speak out for what we believe. Now, risk, who bears it or its consequences, is not evenly or justly distributed in our communities. Those who are marginalized or oppressed always risk more when they challenge systems of injustice, always. LGBTQ people can risk all of those things I mentioned just for being who they are, just for being. Just within our system of Unitarian Universalism, Those religious professionals of color who speak out against their experiences of racism that lives within Unitarian Universalism often have their careers cut short. The average tenure of a UU minister is 7 years, unless you were a person of color, and then it is more like 3 to 5 years. And some prominent UU leaders of color who have most vocally called out institutional racism within our own faith have, I'm very sad to say, also received death threats. Really. To the extent that we have privilege, that privilege often functions to help insulate us from some of this risk. Most people are privileged in some ways and not privileged in others, right? Privilege is relative, it is multifaceted, it is overlapping. We can use the privilege we do have to take risks that we can more easily bear. Speaking up, for example, when it is easier for us to do that than it might be for others. And sometimes in the process, we risk losing the very privilege that protects us. When the very famous founder of American Unitarianism, the Reverend William Ellery Channing, the guy who got this whole ball rolling, finally spoke out against slavery in 1835. After decades of not speaking out against slavery, finally in 1835, he did it. His well-heeled Boston congregants, who formerly adored him, would thereafter cross the street to avoid speaking to him. And I'm sure that that was painful and bewildering. Not as painful as having your ribs broken by the police, but still a very real risk, still painful. And in the face of the real possibility of loss or harm, in the face of the real risks that life asks us to sometimes take, it is normal to face a moment where our courage fails. That's just being human. So how do we recover from that moment when our courage fails? Well, Dr. King prayed. And it was a testament to his character that he did not pray for safety because he knew that safety was impossible. He did not pray to be delivered from the task at hand. He did not pray for his burden of leadership to be lifted. He did not ask for a miracle. He prayed for courage, so he could continue to serve effectively, so he could lead the people in the work that needed to be done. And when his inner voice, which Dr. King identified as God speaking within him, when that voice answered him, it didn't promise him safety either. Safety was off the table. God promised presence, and that's it. The voice promised Dr. King he would not have to do the thing alone, because God would be a constant presence with Dr. King. And for him, that was enough. Now, what does that mean in our theologically diverse Unitarian Universalist context when you may believe in a God who appears as a voice and a presence inside of us, at least sometimes, or you may not. You may not necessarily believe in a personal God or any kind of God. But is there a constant presence that ultimately serves as a ground of courage for you, as an anchor for your spirit in troubled waters? And what is that thing that is present for you? And you may not have thought of this question in exactly these words, so you don't need to be in a rush to answer, but I invite you to just sit with that question. The great 20th century pastor Howard Thurman, mentor to Dr. King, source of our reading today, "Keep fresh before me the moments of my high resolve," he wrote, "that in fair weather or in foul, in good times or in tempests, in the days when the darkness and the foe are nameless or familiar, I may not forget that to which my life is committed. Keep fresh before me the moments of my high resolve," he said. What is it that is with you in the moments of your high resolve? Who or what companions you? Is it God? Is it love? Is it the life force itself, the creative, destructive, endlessly changing, healing, transforming, regenerative energies of the natural world? Is it the ancestors? Or the silent witness of all the brave souls who came before, who found their courage, who risked for those who they knew would come after? In a slightly different context, Dr. King wrote of this question in his 1958 speech called The Power of Nonviolence. Dr. King wrote, "I'm quite aware of the fact that there are persons who believe firmly in nonviolence who do not believe in a personal God. But I believe, he said, every person who believes in nonviolent resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice, that there is something unfolding in the universe, whether one speaks of it as an unconscious process, some unmoved mover, or whether someone speaks of it as a personal God. There is something in the universe, Dr. King said, that unfolds for justice. And this idea that the universe unfolds for justice echoes the very well-known quote by the famous Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, who wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. But from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Right? Quote by Theodore Parker, taken up by Dr. King, and then it lived on a rug in the White House, owned by President Obama. The arc of the universe bends towards justice. In the story, as Dr. King tells it, when his courage came so close to failing that night, what he needed to hear was not that he would be safe, not that he would win, but that he would not be alone, that the same spirit that bends the moral arc of the universe would be with him. And that gave him the courage and strength for all the trials that followed. This was a transformative moment for him, one of those before and after life moments. But before that moment could happen, he needed to recognize and acknowledge the state of his own spirit, the fear and the loss that was happening within him. And Dr. King could have refused to recognize his own faltering courage. If his self-image were such that he could not permit himself weakness, if he practiced denial, then he might never even have had that conversation with God, not recognized the crack that was growing in his own foundation. And then when it mattered, he might have hesitated. He might have pulled back at a moment when he most needed to be present. He might have crumbled. So we need self-awareness enough to know the needs of our heart. We need to be vulnerable enough to admit, first to ourselves, those moments when we are afraid. Dr. King, recognizing that he was thirsty, went to the well. In his case, he prayed. Going to the well may look different for each of you. The poet Nancy Wood said, "My help is in the mountain, where I take myself to heal earthly wounds." Your help may be elsewhere: poetry, music, meditation, or hiking, tarot, or time with the ancestors. What reconnects you to the source of life and love? What reconnects you to the source of your courage, to the presence you will turn to in those moments when your vulnerability, your merely humanness feels vast and overwhelming? Because we need courage right now. We need courage in this moment when books are being banned and some legislators want to silence the truth about our nation's history in our public schools, the history that Dr. King risked his life to confront and change. We need courage when reproductive freedoms are being slowly and not so slowly stripped away in state after state. We need courage when our fellow UUs in Texas are preparing themselves to face criminal penalties rather than turn in their transgender neighbors and congregants and students and friends just for seeking appropriate and necessary medical care. And we need courage in the face of the naked militarism and fascism that has appeared once again on the world stage and is engulfing nations in flames. The world needs our vision, and it needs that vision transformed by courage into creative and steadfast action. So what reconnects you to the source of your courage? Our universalist tradition speaks of a love that is faithful, a love that continues to hold us and connect us even when we feel most alone, a love that is in the end powerful enough to bend the moral arc of the world toward justice. The poet Robert Walsh, writing after an earthquake, said, "When the great plates slip and the earth shivers, look not to more solidity, look not to weighty slabs of concrete, trust more the tensile strands of love that bend and stretch to hold you with the web of life that's often torn, but always healing." In these uncertain times when the ground is so unsteady beneath us, when so many things must be risked and chanced, let us trust in love. And let us find the courage to move forward toward our vision of the beloved community, called on by that which is best and truest within us, knowing that in that moment when our courage is needed, we will not be alone. Blessed be, and amen.